Yo, 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 yo. Chat. We've got a good one today. Yesterday we did the rage spell. Today we're going to do the history of Clash Royale's most annoying card. Let's go.
Firecracker has always been a contentious card in Clash Royale.
Okay.
But why? What could possibly make a 3 elixir common card with less health than a wall breaker the most annoying card in Clash Royale, even when its rates are
Because of the value and the kickback and the splash damage.
average to below average? Well, this card gives a low number of hit points per elixir, so it has to make up for that in other ways. And when that's the case, you end up in a situation where if you have the right cards, it's very easy to counter, but if you don't, then it ends up being a nightmare to deal with. Over time, Supercell typically makes annoying cards like this at least a little more bearable, if not perfect. But in the Firecracker's case, they seemed to only make it worse. Part of the problem is that the community is never happy with the state it's in, leading to players pressuring the devs to make changes not necessary, which they sometimes obliged to. Then later they would try to make it viable again via a different approach, which only repeated.
This is what they do. Yeah, they change it and try and make it good, but in a different approach. But it just ends up being that approach is just more broken than the original concept, you know? Fucking hate this little pink-haired bitch.
Cycle. There's a lot to go over, so without any further ado, let's go all the way back to the beginning of the Firecracker's history, see how it was on launch, cover the balance changes it's received, and explain how it ended up becoming one of the, if not the most game-breakingly overpowered and annoying cards in Clash Royale history.
Well, at least the lights are green. And with a budget direct cover,
Budget direct.
it should be green lights all the way.
With budget direct.
Insurance solved with Budget Direct.
Oh my god.
How do you get to better? Start by putting one foot in front of the other. To get to way better, go one better.
Shut the fuck up.
Before Firecracker was even released, it had gone through a few pre-release adjustments. In the early phases of development, this card's attack was sporadic.
Did I just miss that? Did the pink-haired chick just shoot fucking fireballs?
Before Firecracker was even released, it had gone through a few pre-release adjustments. In the early phases of development, this card's attack was sporadic and could never really hit what you wanted. It was clunky and hard to use, but one thing to notice is that her attacks apparently were going to deal knockback, which is crazy because on top of her attack, she would recoil. Dealing knockback and recoil would have made it even more difficult than it already was for enemy troops to approach her. The recoil was a staple feature of this card that did make it into the final version. Firecracker was small, but had such a big attack that the force of it knocked her back. The only other card with a recoil attack was Sparky, who was a legendary, and even in that case, it only pushed her back 3/4 of a tile, unlike the Firecracker, whose recoil pushed her back 2 tiles. Before she got the name Firecracker, she was known as the Rocketeer, but the devs explained that the name didn't quite feel
she's kinda bad.
right. Her attack was eventually changed to have one main burst of damage on a targeted troop, then having that split into a string of smaller projectiles spread over a wide range, splashing onto everything in any one of those paths. There were 5 small projectiles, and each one dealt 1/5 of the damage from the original burst. This was a very unique style of attack because the attack would only pierce through troops once its main attack reached its target. Not only was it cheap, but it could attack air unlike the bowler, and her projectile had a much wider radius than Magic Archer. Of course, her main disadvantage was that she died to arrows. This meant your opponent could save their arrows for this card, which might force you to adapt by including other cards to bait out that spell. However, she could at least survive a log unlike a princess because she had the same amount of health as an archer. You might have recognized if you're at all familiar with Supercell games that this card looks strangely reminiscent of an archer, which is on purpose. According to her lore by the company, she was an archer but didn't like being an archer, so she left archer school and came across for a long time. This card came out in January 2020, and the last time a common card had been released.
Chat, 2021. I was in year 7. I remember Firecracker got added just a year before that, obviously. I wasn't playing Clash in year 6, I re-downloaded it in year 7. She used to have this, oh god, just aura. I hated it, man. you would build up the whole push, like, just even now, like, with the Evo, man, don't get me started on the fucking Evo, but you just, like, get a whole push, right? You know, you just spend, like, fucking 16 elixir, and then this pink-haired bitch just destroys the whole thing.
Prior to this was the Royal Recruits in July 2018. Sometimes when a certain card rarity hasn't been released in a while, they just make a new card a different
when
rarity
Goblin
than it
Juggernaut
would have
did,
been
yeah.
otherwise. The team also admitted that there were so many cards in the game now that each new card had to have something special and unique to add to the game. But the problem was that if you followed that threshold, no card would ever be common again since they're supposed to be
Just like this guy. We like this guy.
very simple, basic, and easy to understand. Seth, the community manager, even put out a tweet saying that this card was a, quote, princess for the people, a common alternative to princess or magic archer.
Seth might
They
be
simply
under the
wanted
influence of
complex
marijuana.
mechanics like this to be more accessible. You can also see from this tweet that the Firecracker's firework is an air defense from Clash of Clans. If rarity was determined by how much effort was put into a card, I can understand the common rarity since everything about this card is borrowed. Even its attack was just taken from a Brawl Stars character. Not to diss on Supercell or anything, this is a special troop that adds something valuable, and it's nice to make cards common to make it easier for players to level up when they just as easily could have made it epic or
Level up, bro.
legendary.
It's in like Arena 13. What do you mean level up? Like it was easy. I remember it was like level 12, level 13, Arena 13 or some shit. This card was a grind to get to, especially if you're young.
Essentially locking it behind a paywall or a year of grinding. Her projectile range was so long that it could actually hit buildings sitting behind a princess tower like spawners or elixir pump. This was cool because not many cards could hit back there. However, this super long projectile range was a double-edged sword because it made it easy to activate the King Tower
doesn't
against.
matter, bro.
In
She's
Clash
so good, she
Royale,
gets
you may
shield
know that
value.
even if you deal a sliver of damage to your opponent's King Tower, it will activate, therefore becoming a permanent additional defense, which you do not want. If your opponent has one of a few select cards, then they can activate their King Tower if you have one of a different selection of cards. However, in the Firecracker's case, the opponent could place any troop in a spot angled perfectly between the Firecracker and their King Tower, and the Firecracker would
downside,
target
though.
onto it, with its splash reaching just far enough to set it
Literally the
off.
only
There was
downside
no
of it.
safe deck to go against where you didn't have to worry about this, which was certainly a major disadvantage.
Look!
Certain win
Look at the
conditions that
value.
relied on the King Tower not being activated, like Graveyard, would never be able to work with
Yeah,
it
but
because
why
of
would
this
you-
fact
yeah, why
alone.
would you use-
Fun fact, in 2v2,
Who is using Firecracker in Graveyard? Like, what? The game's been out for like 9 years, bro.
since the towers are a bit closer together, the King Tower will always get hit by a Firecracker attack if its main attack hits the Princess Tower, even if the opponent does nothing.
Yeah, we
As
already
we
know
already
this.
discussed, her health was a
Yeah,
major
yeah.
weakness, but another weakness was her hit speed, attacking only once every 3 seconds,
doesn't
the same
matter.
as a Princess. She wasn't great in a lot of one-on-one interactions. You would want to use her a lot against slow, heavy beatdown pushes, especially when they had well-protected support units.
look at that
She was
push.
a solid alternative to cards like Bomber, Princess, and even Wizard. She had the same vulnerabilities, but dealt a lot more
Alternative to
damage and was
Wizard.
just as good, if not better than the competition.
alternative.
Especially against something like Barbarian HUD, where she would never cross the river because a recoil would cause her to stay on defense, and the Barbarians would never catch or deal any damage to her. The recoil was definitely the main gimmick, and players were pretty quick to call
fucking hate
Firecracker the most annoying card in the game because of this. But why exactly? Well, for starters, a lot of cards had a lot of trouble killing it because it would always propel itself out of range. Since a Firecracker knocks itself back 2 tiles per attack, that means if a card was just about to attack it but it propelled itself
And then Hog Firecracker became a thing.
away, it would take a full 2 seconds for a card with a medium movement speed to catch up, or 1.5 seconds for a fast card, which makes a significant difference. This recoil also made it very unpredictable. If you were using a spell with a small radius, it might be hard to predict exactly where the
Yes, the amount of
Firecracker is going
times
to
you
be
just-
by the
look
time
at
the
this.
spell lands.
Jeez,
Sometimes
bro.
it doesn't attack when you think
card
it
should
will,
not be
and
allowed
vice
to do that.
versa. The problem here was that it was much harder to counter than it was to play.
man.
Even though you kind of had to angle it right to maximize its value, the
Right.
unpredictability and constant movement made it a nightmare to play against if you didn't have an easy spell. What made it even worse was that she had an 8.5 tile sight range, which is longer than most troops,
No, her range
especially for a
needs to be
non-building
nerfed. Her
targeting
range
troop.
needs to be nerfed.
Usually a longer sight range is a bad thing, but in this case it only contributed to the Firecracker's annoyingness, because even if she was
her
walking down
bloody
an empty lane
range
and there was
needs to be
action in the
nerfed.
opposite lane, she would walk over and assist on defense. This was certainly a complicated card, which was going to make for a messy launch. Firecracker was officially released on January 6th, 2020, and it did not set a good tone for the year because it was instantly a very hated card.
It was
Taking a
broken.
look at the stats about a week after launch, you can see it was actually a
23%
top 10
user
card in
rate,
challenges.
50%
But just a
win
few
rate.
days later, its rates fell to about average. Part of this can be attributed to new card hype. Obviously, everyone is going to want to try the new card, which can artificially boost usage in the beginning. But this really goes back to what I said about this card being easy to play but difficult
Yeah,
to
but she's
counter.
not a win condition.
Okay, you're on YouTube watching a classic Mitski video. But did you know there's a YouTube music app?
This card could get a lot of value if players didn't know how to properly counter it, and since most players didn't know how to properly counter it since it was brand new, it attracted a lot of usage.
Arrow
Once
users.
players quickly adapted, it lost a lot of its flair. It reminded me a lot of the Wizard situation when the game first came out. Wizard was never really that good of a card, but when the game first came out, he was easy to use and not so easy to counter, which made him a very popular choice. But he very quickly died down before the beta period even ended and wasn't able to be relevant again despite
Wizard's
receiving
dog
numerous
shit.
buffs beyond
If you
that
use
point
Wizard,
just
you're a
because of
bum.
how bad he truly was. Despite being not as good as initially thought though, it was still a decent card that could be very useful. The
Look
most
at this,
popular
just
deck you
walks
saw
out.
right away was this Hog Rider Cycle deck, which was very unexpected
Don't.
because your opponent would almost certainly activate the
Don't.
buzz.
What did you
Despite
just
being not
mention?
as good as initially thought though, it was still a decent card that could be very useful. The most popular deck you saw right away was this Hog
Huggy cute. This is like, this deck walked so Hog Firecracker could run.
Rider Cycle deck, which was very unexpected because your opponent would almost certainly activate their King Tower if you used her, and then it would assist in taking out future Hog Riders.
Yep.
She was expected to thrive in siege decks where
She's
activating
broken.
the King didn't matter. The beauty of this deck was that it was built in a way that made it difficult for the opponent to exploit its weakness because you would typically always play a Hog Rider in front of the
Yep.
Firecracker before it crossed
And
the
then
bridge.
destroy everything.
There were basically three options when it came to defending a Hog Firecracker combo. You activate the King Tower, which gives the Hog and Firecracker
place it in
more
front
time
of the
to deal
Firecracker
damage
and
to
place
the
another
tower.
card, but you
You
waste
defend
too
the
much elixir.
Firecracker, which gives the Hog more time to attack the tower, or you defend the Hog and the Firecracker's attack splashes onto your defense and the tower. It was a tricky combo to deal
Yeah,
with.
she does, like, the same
Although
amount
she
of
seems
damage
fair and
as
balanced in
Hog if
competitive
it
play
connects.
as pro players learn to counter her properly, you have to remember not every player is created equal. She was tricky to counter,
Yeah, you
easy
hear
to
that?
play.
Dogs is better than everyone. Oh, jeez, Rick. I don't really know about this. Dogs is really good at Clash.
And a common card, which is a textbook recipe for a mid-ladder menace. A card that thrives in mid to lower areas of ladder despite being balanced or even weak in competitive play. These are some of the loudest players in the Clash community, and they're not advocating for changes based on rates and data, but rather on what they personally experience. Now, it wasn't as bad as something like Wizard or Witch, since overleveling Firecracker didn't cause any significant interaction changes, but regardless of level, she was annoying. However, by March, she was sometimes being replaced by Magic Archer. Despite her uniqueness, she was in a competitive niche.
Powerade,
There were a
please,
lot of 3 to 4 elixir ranged cards that filled a similar purpose, so she was very often going to have trouble standing out even when she provided adequate value.
Yep.
Magic Archer was a decent replacement
No.
because he could also
No,
pierce
he
through Hog
wasn't.
defenders
No,
and
he
hit
wasn't,
the
though.
tower,
He
while
wasn't.
dealing more damage per second,
No.
survive arrows,
Nope.
and not have the disadvantage
Nope.
of being easy
Nope.
to activate
Nope.
King Towers against.
Lies.
It gave you the freedom to just use it on defense and not have to properly support it once it went across the bridge. Regardless of the Magic Archer's advantages though, Firecracker was still
Better.
the primary pick for
Better,
this deck.
exactly.
It's just worth acknowledging how replaceable she was.
No.
Although it seemed like she was destined to be a one-deck wonder, she would eventually be integrated into other decks around May. This Royal Hogs deck was on the rise, where Firecracker was useful for the same reason she was useful in regular Hog Rider decks. She was finally securing her place in these Hog decks as a swarm clear and
That's
secondary tower damage source.
she's
In the
so
same
good,
month,
man.
this Firecracker
just
Royal
better than
Giant deck
Princess.
also rose, which is the type of deck I think most people were expecting this card to be viable in originally. The amount of bonus tower damage you could get was crazy. She was practically a secondary
I
win
remember in
condition.
1v1s, everyone's level was level 9, and then they changed
Firecracker was in an excellent position. It was seen with a variety of win conditions in a variety of decks, and her raids were fine. At least until June. Although it wouldn't get a direct nerf, the two spells it was almost always seen with, Earthquake and Royal Delivery, would. Following those changes, the Hog and Royal Hog decks Firecracker was commonly seen in were dissipating. However, Royal Giant was able to adapt with it nicely, with Firecracker appearing in multiple new variants. So although Hog decks with Firecracker were played less,
'cause-
Firecracker's individual rates actually had an upsurge.
How much
It was
elixir
definitely
is
one of the best cards in
Hunter?
its
Isn't he
niche
5
now.
elixir?
It even started to see some play with Mortar. However, this boost in performance seems to tip the card over the edge because the following month, Firecracker would receive a nerf, which
Espirito
seems
Endure.
absurd just from analyzing its stats. This card consistently had average rates for months, but then they rise to slightly above average for not even a month and it gets the nerf hammer. Seth had even exclaimed in
Good.
the past that they had
I
to
hate-
be
I hate
cautious
the
about
card.
not
I always
nerfing cards
hated
that
it.
were strong for one
Get rid
month
of
only,
Firecracker.
and this was clearly the case with Firecracker. I'm focusing on competitive stats only because that's typically the environment cards are used at their fullest potential, and those are the stats Supercell almost always
Being
balance off
competitive.
of. But this case may have been one of the few rare exceptions. You see, the most popular win conditions Firecracker worked best with, Royal Giant and Hog Rider, were much more popular in low areas of ladder than challenges. So if you were in some of these lower ranges, you'd go against
Firecracker
Firecracker way more
every-
than 13% of the time. I don't have the exact stats for every specific
So
area of ladder
annoying,
during this
man.
time, but even generally you can see the distinction. The community was hounding for nerfs, saying that they should reduce its recoil distance or make it die to log. It didn't
Yes.
matter if it was
No,
statistically
they should introduce that now. Make it unlogged.
balanced and had fair counterplay. It was annoying. So Supercell gave in and announced they would reduce its recoil distance from 2 to 1.5 tiles, making it easier for melee cards to catch her.
still not good.
1.5 tiles is a little less than the range of a melee long card, so if you placed a melee long card right on top of it, it wouldn't be able to blast itself out of range anymore. This was a pretty big nerf, but the community loved it. Everyone was so tired of seeing Firecracker that it wasn't going to bother people
also
if
had
she
this
became
retarget
unviable.
glitch. I
This
don't know
change
if
would
he's
go
gonna
live on
mention that.
July 7th, and you pretty quickly saw a massive drop in popularity following it. She relied so heavily on that recoil, so it being reduced by 25% made her die in a lot of situations she would have been fine in before. The change could have been fine if they had compensated by buffing a different stat, but
Chat,
it seems like they wanted to
follow me,
appease the player base
type under
more
this
than
VOD
properly
or
balancing
this
it.
YouTube video
For the
when this
remainder of
comes out on
2020,
YouTube,
its
and
use rate
just say what
remains
card you
between
want me
2
to
to
react to
3%
next.
with a very poor win rate, and it wouldn't receive any more balance changes this year. It rarely appeared in a top deck in the latter half of 2020. The only one I could find was this Mortar one in August that we saw back in June, but
Yeah.
even in this case, the dominant
That's just
variant was running
Reinsurgence.
Musketeer instead of Firecracker. Despite it underperforming since the July nerf, not only were people not asking for buffs, but further nerfs. With people's hatred of her being so strong, it deterred Supercell from applying any buffs, no matter
Good.
how much she may have needed them.
Good.
And because of that, her future was looking bleak.
Good.
2021 started off like the end of 2020, low use in win rates and struggling to reach the top deck list. She was still appearing occasionally with Mortar, but it couldn't hold its place long. Although it seemed like this year was just going to be a continuation of 2020, things would take an interesting turn. Starting around April, you began to see a small comeback of Hog Earthquake Firecracker decks, sparked by an Earthquake rework in February that made it deal more damage to buildings. The Firecracker recoil didn't matter as much when it came to supporting the Hog Rider on offense, but ever since that devastating Earthquake nerf in June 2020, it hadn't been able to play its part in keeping that deck viable. Now, since it was better at shredding buildings, this deck was able to work again. It wouldn't stop there though, because in June 2021,
Hog
we saw the
EQ is
release
better
of the
than
Goblin
Hog
Drill, which was
Cycle,
very
man, I said it.
influential on release, and Firecracker became a very popular synergizer to it, thanks to being able to keep defending troops near the tower for a prolonged period of time. For a brief period, this Goblin Drill deck was the most used deck in the entire game. It was surprising to see Firecracker be a part of the most played deck in the game, considering it was barely even able to make it into the top 20 list for almost a year
remember when
now.
they nerfed
Its
Valk's
individual
health, bro.
rates had
Valkyrie's
noticeably
health,
risen thanks to
God.
this. Although it wouldn't see too much play with Goblin Drill after it was nerfed, it continued to see plenty of use in Hog Earthquake, which would remain in the top deck list for the foreseeable future. With Earthquake in a more stable position, this deck was able to thrive without worry of the nerf hammer. It's kind of interesting to think about how Earthquake, a spell that's used to take down buildings, seemingly completely disconnected from Firecracker, can be directly responsible as to how Firecracker performs. But when you think about how this deck functions, it all makes sense. It's all about clearing a path for the Hog Rider. The Earthquake clears the buildings, the Valkyrie or Knight tanks whatever is meant for the Hog, and the Firecracker takes care of defensive swarms and or whittle down whatever
you
other
just
defense is
Bible
there while
cycle
helping
if
to take
all
down the
that
tower
shit doesn't
directly.
work, bro.
If one of those three cards can't do their job, the whole deck falls apart.
No, you
Taking a
Bible
look at the top
cycle.
200 decks during the middle of October 2021, Firecracker was used in
Look how much
10
health
total,
Valk had,
9 of
man.
which were This
Jeez.
exact variant of
Robot
Hog
Max
Cycle.
Route.
It
Such
was
a
on shaky
baddie.
grounds, but it could have been worse. The rates had been trickling down ever since the Goblin Drill peak, but it seemed like the hatred towards this card was only
do we just do
increasing.
double
There were so many
Firecracker
calls
at
for
range?
nerfs, citing how unpredictable it was and how it was still so difficult to counter if you didn't have arrows. One thing players pointed out as being especially frustrating was when she propelled herself into the opposite lane while attacking something, then walked back into the lane she was originally
did
in
she
after
do that?
finishing, because that's not what a card is supposed to do. If we take a look at the stats in November 2021, we can see in Grand Challenges her
Chat, she still does that now. I think. I'm pretty sure she still does that. Yeah, she still does it.
rates were quite bad, but in ladder, she was
Think so.
seeing a lot more success. Firecracker was a mid-ladder menace, and that's an incredibly ugly spot to be in. But despite the pressure on Supercell to do something, they would end up doing
Yeah, these guys are so goofy. These guys.
nothing at all. Well, except for tweeting out a sarcastic remark reminding players there was an easy way if she really was that bad, but players did not take that well. In all of 2021, Firecracker would be a mid-ladder menace, and that's an incredibly ugly spot to be in. But despite the pressure on Supercell to do
did
something,
they say?
they would end up doing nothing at all. Well, except for tweeting out a sarcastic remark reminding players there
Clash
was an
Royale
easy way
players.
if she really was that bad, but players did not take
Firecracker should explode when she does. Who gives a shit? Game's dead. No one hates Firecracker. We only hate skeevy, shitty devs that rig their game's ladder system. Random matches based on level or suck it and keep being despised by people who used to respect you. Sell out human garbage leader. Fuck you and fuck all the cheaters in your game. Cheaters. Fuck you and fuck all the cheaters in your game. Fuck you and fuck. Okay.
take that
Alright,
well.
bud, you
In
doing
all
it.
of 2021, Firecracker would receive absolutely no balance changes, but in December, both the Fire Spirit
Look how
and
much
Tesla
health the Valkyrie had. Oh, scareballs.
would get nerfed, hurting the Firecracker's best deck. Going into 2022, you still saw this deck getting some decent play, but it wasn't performing nearly as well anymore. And if the December nerfs weren't enough, the Valkyrie and Earthquake would get nerfed the
Yep,
following April.
there it is.
That was pretty much the final
I
nail in the
actually
coffin for
hated
this
the
deck,
Valk
and
nerf,
thus
man.
the Firecracker. At least for now. The meta was shifting for good now. It wasn't just one card holding her back that would be fixed in a few months. She was in wizard territory, along with the other forgotten mid-ladder menaces, having one of the lowest win rates in the game, being a solid bottom 5 card.
Yeah,
She was
good
no
job.
longer useful, she had no place.
Can we
All
stop
because she was
firecrackering
too
at bridge?
annoying. If they had just never reduced her recoil, she'd probably still be a healthy card, at least stat-wise. But
Right.
even now at her worst, possibly ever, there were still calls for nerfs. A poll I found from June 2022 found the majority of players wanted her to stay the same or get nerfed. Not even a rework. She was bad, and people were happy about that.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, here are her stats from the day the poll was taken. She was
Bud, I can't read Japanese.
definitely going to need some sort of rework to make people happy. A lot of people have been requesting for her to die to the log, so perhaps they could have decreased her health in exchange for some extra damage or a faster attack, but I think that would have only made her more
Well, she
obnoxious
just
to players who
destroys
didn't have
everything.
that spell. Plus, if she could survive the log by being one level higher, over-leveling would be more of an issue. There wasn't going to be a move that would make everyone happy, so for the second full year, Firecracker would receive absolutely no balance changes, remaining unviable. The hope for Firecracker had really died down by now. It was in the
Good.
same position as Wizard and Witch, good for casual players, only useful when overleveled, and would be tossed aside for good when the player reached a certain point. Wizard and Witch had gone years without a balance change, so there was no reason to believe Firecracker wouldn't suffer the same fate. But shockingly, in February 2023, out of the blue, this card would appear in the balance changes for the first time in nearly 3 years. This change was simply decreasing its first hit attack time by 0.4 of a second.
So
This
above.
buff was a huge deal. Being able to land that first shot 40% faster would help so much when supporting something like Hog on offense. Shooting 0.4 of a second faster meant 0.4 of a second less reaction time for the opponent.
That got nerfed. That's
Supercell
not in the
explains
game
that this
now.
was to help fix an issue where it would freeze out when facing multiple units.
Okay, now he's covering what I was saying.
I didn't really
Watch
talk
this.
about this, but this was
Yes.
another major issue since day one. You see, Firecracker wasn't just annoying to play against, but also
With.
annoying to play. You can find a lot of old replays of people upset that their Firecrackers would just stand there for several seconds not shooting a single thing. This happens because her target died right before she
Yep.
was about to attack, causing her to retarget onto another target. But each time this happened, her first hit attack time
What
was
is she
reset.
doing?
This would be
I
good if she
hated
was a
when she
single
used to do
target
this.
unit, but she obviously wasn't. Even if her main target died, her shot could have helped deal with surrounding units. Firecracker wasn't the only card with this 3 targeting mechanic, but it was abundantly more obvious and detrimental in her case because she had one of the slowest first hit attacks in the game. She actually had the slowest first hit attack for any splash troop besides Sparky, whom she was tied with, which is why this buff was probably the best buff they could have given
They're
it.
gonna change it,
Expectedly,
surely.
players were not happy at this announcement. The feedback was overwhelmingly negative, but it was nice to see the balancing team try something and not just let it rot like its mid-ladder companions.
Good.
Players braced for the worst, but after a short period of hype, it was performing poorly again.
Yeah.
It was certainly still much better than before though. You really only saw her in a few Hog cycle decks, including the old Valkyrie Earthquake one. Most people considered Firecracker to be a solid card now despite the underperformance. It was partially bad timing because the archers were overbuffed at the same
Yeah, I
time, which
remember
heavily
this.
increased their prominence, so you saw them used
They
in a
did
lot of
so much
siege decks that
damage.
perhaps would have run Firecracker if there wasn't a similar, more appealing option.
think they got a buff
Plus, this
Fire
also
Ant
had
at
the
some
effect of
point.
making arrows insanely popular, so more people than usual had a hard counter ready to go. Not to mention, one of the side effects of this Firecracker buff actually hurt it in a way, being that you had a bigger window of opportunity as a defender to force it to attack your troop positioned in a way to make the attack activate your king tower. Even after the April balance changes though, which fixed the archers issue by ironically giving it the opposite change Firecracker had just received, you weren't seeing a ton of Firecracker play. The environment still just wasn't quite suited for her. You saw her occasionally in the top 200, but she wasn't quite finding her place. At least until June 2023, which would perhaps be the most eventful month for Firecracker in Clash Royale history. Firstly, she would receive another balance change, which would be decreasing her first hit attack time
Good.
by another 20th of a second,
Good.
which sounds pointless, and in most situations you would never notice the difference, but in this case it meant a lot, because now when Firecracker was going against the enemy tower, she would always get a hit in before she died, whereas before, that hit was determined on whether you were true red or true blue. Remember, each Firecracker hit dealt more damage to towers than a lightning spell, so whether
Yeah,
it was
that's
able to
what
get
I'm
that hit or
saying.
not was a big deal. Following the balance changes, this card had a staggering rise in usage, mostly appearing in this Hog Earthquake deck that also included the Mighty Miner. Not only was this a very popular deck, but it became the most used deck in Clash Royale, especially if you include both variants.
Fuck
It
off.
wasn't seen too heavily outside of
Fuck
this
off.
deck, but it certainly
Fuck
had a lot
off.
more potential now.
That's a
The future
deck
was
that
looking
just shouldn't
bright,
be
but just when
allowed.
things were looking steady, Supercell pulled a Supercell. Just a few weeks after this buff, Clash Royale would implement a game-changing feature: evolutions. Certain cards would now be given new special abilities and stat bonuses
These guys
to
fell
help
off.
spice up the
Barbarians
game.
fell off.
And what better card to pick to be the first one to receive them?
Bro, words cannot describe how much I fucking hate Evo Firecracker, man. She gets too much value in so many situations. These guys were pretty. Yeah, we're okay. He's just a good Evo. He's annoying though. These guys fell off. This one though is a fucking bitch. to deal
And the
with.
card everybody has been calling the most annoying card
Yep.
in Clash Royale for over 3 years. That's right, on June 19th, 2023,
man,
everyone's
why?
favorite pink-haired menace was getting a massive upgrade. You would only get
That's
to play
like
in a
adding Evo Hog Rider. Like, or Evo Expo. Like,
Vault Firecracker
You know what I
for
mean?
every 2 regular ones you played, but it was very worth it. Firstly, on top of the regular damage it dealt, each attack left
Yep, and
1
you could
big and
cycle.
5 small circular areas that dealt
so not
damage
only could you cycle because it's a cycle deck, but you could also get 3-card cycle with the champion, with the Mighty Miner in there. So you just get to the Evo Firecracker a lot more, and the Hogs. You just spam Hogs and Evo Firecrackers, and it basically just deletes everything in the game. Like, you just can't do anything. It's fucking just abysmal.
over time, similar to Poison. The big one was 2.5 tiles big, the same as a zap spell, and dealt 510 damage over a period of 2.5 seconds. The 5 small ones were half the size, dealt the same damage per second, but only lasted 2 seconds, meaning each totaled 408 damage. Basically, it was between arrows and fireball in terms of damage. This is an absurd amount of extra damage, so these spark auras would only deal 30%
Yep,
of their
see,
total
same push over and over again, and that tower's going to be deleted.
damage to towers. But that's still 180 extra damage if the big spark touches the tower, and 140 for each little spark. These extra spark auras were the big special ability this evolution had going for it, but that was far from all it got. On
got
top of
buffed.
this,
She got
its
buffed,
health was
didn't she?
increased
No.
by 43%
No,
to
no.
just about what a royal delivery deals, meaning it no longer died to arrows.
Yeah.
And finally,
the stat increase, bro. Supercell fucked up so bad when they introduced the bloody stat increases, man. Like Evo Bomber couldn't die to arrows as well. Like
its recoil distance was increased back to 2 tiles, so she'd be just as obnoxious to catch as in the good old days. Now, of course, there's the caveat that you can only use one evolution
yeah.
per deck,
No,
and
you
there
could
were
run it.
3
You
others
could always
launching
run it.
beside it. But evolved barbarians or skeletons upgrades weren't even close to this. To break it down, they gave a previously healthy card a ton of extra damage,
It
a
was
ton
not
of extra health, and reverted the change that made it from great to meh. All for the card that's been widely regarded as the most annoying card in the game. Surely this is the recipe for a happy player base.
no.
Firecracker Royale was frustrating players to no end. After years of players ridiculing this card and kicking her while she's down, everyone was now bowing to her. She was unstoppable. I don't think I've ever seen more calls for an emergency nerf than I did in this case. Players were leaving the game.
What did he say?
I don't think I've ever seen more calls for an emergency nerf than I did in this
Juicy Brad G said, "She's the reason I drink."
case. Players were leaving the game in droves.
What was the other comment?
Firecracker Royale was frustrating players to no end. After years of players ridiculing this card and kicking her while she's
off.
down, everyone was now bowing to her. She was unstoppable. I don't think I've ever seen more calls for an emergency nerf than I did in this.
Paul Firecracker is worse than Hitler. What? Clash Royale Cycle Check. Future employment.
This case.
What is
Players
it?
were
What
leaving
is
the game
Clash
in
Royale?
droves. The user could drop a firecracker, which would shoot something near the opponent's tower in 1
Yeah.
second, which would splash onto the tower, dealing upwards of 800 damage per shot at level 14. More than a charging battle ram. It's hard to compare it to other broken cards in the past since you had to play the regular version to get to it, but I think it's safe to say Firecracker during this era ranks as being one of the most
Best cards in the game.
overpowered cards in
Yep.
Clash Royale
History.
She was appearing with so many win conditions, from Hog Rider to Royal Hogs to Miner to Goblin Drill to Mortar. Pretty much any fast cycle deck benefited from this evolution. I even found this interesting deck with the Monk, and no win
What's up,
conditions
Bridge
reached the
Stand
top 200. At this point, Evolved Firecracker was a win condition. No,
Yeah.
literally, it was.
It was?
The fact it was a primary source of tower damage
Honestly,
in the decks it was
man,
in,
like-
and it was able to consistently get that damage, makes it
Look!
by definition a win condition. Even the official Clash Royale esports account tweeted a joke asking which support card was best to go with her. There was never a better way to spend 3
do
elixir
a
than
little
right
trolling.
now. For 2 grueling weeks, this was the situation.
Yep.
Until
Still
June
is.
30th,
No,
where we
it
would
still is.
finally get balance changes. There were so many paths to choose. They could decrease the sparks damage on crown towers, make the recoil back to normal,
Remove
or let
the-
it die to arrows. But they didn't go
on.
with any of these.
No.
Instead, they
Why not?
opted to increase its
Supercell
first hit
never
attack
does.
by 1/20th of a second, which
Oh,
applied to the
whoa.
regular and evolved version.
Whoa.
Now, I did actually skip over one important thing because I wanted to focus on the power of the evolved Firecracker. Going back to the same day the evolution was released, the normal Firecracker's first hit attack time was reverted back to 0.6 of a second,
Oh.
which was unusual because why would you revert something that was meant to fix a consistency issue?
Yeah.
I looked into it and couldn't find it mentioned in any official patch notes, which suggests this
That's
change was
Supercell.
implemented by accident. Stuff like this has happened
Shout out to
before and it's
Supercell.
usually fixed quickly, but now since Firecracker was the strongest card in the game, it wasn't a great time to fix a change that would make it even stronger than it already was. But they couldn't just leave this inconsistency,
No, of
so
course.
they fixed it in a different way. The consistency was fixed by making the tower always hit the Firecracker first instead of never.
Yes, thank
it was an
God.
alright change, but
Yeah.
so small considering
Still
the
good,
magnum
though.
power of this beast. These balance changes were unscheduled and were really just meant to tone things down a bit while they found a proper way to balance it. But this unfortunately meant another
was
month
moving-
of Firecracker Royale.
Bro,
this
she
was
was
a
moving
very
like
unfun
prime-
time
like
to be playing
prime
the
Bron,
game.
bro.
Firecracker made a lot of people
LeBron.
upset at just the concept
fuck
of
it, yeah, and
evolutions
Vaughn,
in
yeah.
general. Because evolutions at their core are meant to be this way. Maybe not this powerful,
No.
but with no downsides compared to just playing the normal card,
Yeah.
it meant a stronger, more annoying Firecracker
Yes.
was always going to exist without a complete overhaul to the feature. CRL was going on in July, and
survive a
every
fucking
single
bandit
match was
dash?
using the same few evolutions, and it got really repetitive just seeing the same few cards being used over and over. There was a huge lack of diversity, and Evolved Firecracker specifically just seemed to lower the skill cap. It wasn't exactly clear what Supercell wanted to see from this feature, but what was clear was that Firecracker was ruining the game. So in the next set of balance changes in August
Surprise,
2023, Supercell would come down hard. So originally there was a planned set of nerfs which involved decreasing the big and small spark durations by half a second and decreasing its hit points by 7%. The amount of damage these sparks did to towers seemed to be the biggest issue, and there was really no reason for her to have as much health as she did. The team was open to feedback on these nerfs, and boy did they get a lot. They ended up going with a completely different set of nerfs after reading countless comments. The health decrease was changed from 7 to 9% thanks to a Reddit post that garnered thousands of upvotes detailing a lot of major interaction changes that would happen if this happened. Although arrows still wouldn't be
Supercell needs a whole fucking diagram and explanation of what would happen if they buffed, nerfed, reworked, just for them to do their job instead of them figuring it out. Like,
enough, there were
disgraceful.
still a lot of cards that would be better against it. And instead of reducing the spark duration, they changed it so that multiple sparks couldn't deal damage to the same enemy at the same time, which was
Oh, so it
huge
wouldn't
considering
stack,
when
that's
used
better.
against a tower, you could easily have 3 to 4 of these on it at
Yeah.
once. That's a 66 to 75% total damage decrease from sparks.
Good.
And finally, to match the change it had received almost exactly 3 years prior, its pushback range was decreased from 2 to 1.5 tiles
It's
because
still,
it
like,
was
amazingly good.
so annoying. I actually think it made sense for the pushback range to be higher for the evolution because its shot was much more powerful, but for the sake of thousands of players' mental stability, it was best to reduce it back. These were some pretty hefty nerfs. Some thought this was a little overboard, but I don't think most people cared. The fact it still didn't die to arrows would keep it strong, but it wouldn't be the dominant evolution after this. A few weeks into August, the card was pretty much back to where it was after the June buff, but before the evolution was added. This is pretty much where the evolved Firecracker would stay for a while,
Oh,
but come
great.
October, you
Yep.
would see regular Firecracker a lot more in the competitive scene. You saw a resurgence of the infamous Hog Earthquake deck
me,
replacing
man.
Valkyrie with the new
Hog
Evolved
EQ,
Knight,
man.
and this split lane pressure Swarm Bait deck with the new Evolved Royal Recruits. Both regular and evolved Firecracker had unique roles in
Did
this
we just
meta
wall
and
break
saw
up?
about the same amount
Did
of
we just-
play. It was a
Yeah.
Firecracker heavy meta. Despite the nerfs, she was as relevant as ever. The meta was still unstable from the poor implementation of evolutions though. It shifted every month when new ones were added, so even 1 month later when we got evolution archers and a new card, you saw a fairly big dip in Firecracker usage.
That happens.
Delivering books to remote First Nations communities.
Spirit Empress is in the bad card. I like what they
Together
did.
with the
Not too
indi-
broken.
The next notable development would come in February
Fuck off.
2024,
I hate
after
this card.
Supercell let players use 2 evolutions in a single deck rather
Hey,
than
I actually
just
didn't mind
one.
this change.
With only 13 evolutions
is
in the
better.
game as of that month, it encouraged a lot more usage for every evolution. Pretty much overnight, Evolved Firecracker's use rate doubled because it wasn't competing with evolutions
If
for
you're not
space as
using
much
an
in the
Evo
deck
on your deck,
anymore. But as a
might be
consequence,
brain
non-evolved
dead, or you
Firecracker
just
was
don't have one.
basically never used in competitive play anymore. There weren't really any new decks with Firecracker forming, but rather the already popular decks that used non-evolved Firecracker were using the evolved one now. However, there was another problem, being the new evolved Bomber, which dropped right as the second evolution slot did. Evolved Bomber had the same advantage Firecracker
Yeah, she
did,
got
which
mad
was being able
replaced,
to deal
though.
quick damage
Yep.
to the tower from the bridge. Plus, it had a faster hit speed, cost 1 less elixir, and only took 1 cycle to get to. The only real disadvantages was that it couldn't hit air and it died to arrows, but that didn't really
No.
matter as much
What?
when
I
going
thought
for
it
some
didn't,
quick cheap
man.
tower damage. Sure, Firecracker was a more reliable defense, but its primary function was taking down towers, and that's what mattered most. Firecracker's rates dwindled for months thanks to Bomber. By April, it had the lowest win rate of any evolution, being stuck in that spot where it's alright in a few somewhat popular decks, but terrible outside of them. As the environment filled with more and more evolutions, it got more and more boxed out. It might have been alright to leave it alone given the circumstances, but the devs decided to give it a rework anyway in May 2024. Its spark durations would be increased by half a second each, and now any enemy troop standing inside of one would move 15% slower, just like poison. These attack buffs would be at the cost of some hit points though. More specifically, Evolved Firecracker would
Could
now
die
have
to
the
arrows.
exact number of hit points as a regular Firecracker,
Yes,
meaning arrows
she
were
could die to
finally a
arrows.
reliable hard
Good.
counter. This was probably the most advocated change since the
But they
Evolutions
coulda
edition,
just-
so you can imagine there was a lot
like-
of excitement surrounding
Chat, they could have just not made it slower and just nerfed her health anyways.
this announcement. Even though it did get some crazy buffs, everyone knew that it dying to arrows was a huge blow. Now, it was better in a scenario where the opponent didn't have arrows, but Firecracker wasn't the only evolution whose health was decreased. Following these changes, that spell would hard counter so many evolutions, leading to an explosion of arrows usage. Ultimately,
Arrows
this rework
underrated
didn't make a
in my
difference in the
opinion.
card's
I swear I never
performance.
used it, but it's
However,
so
given they
good.
were able to make it less frustrating to go against, I'd say the rework was still a success. The amount of play it was seeing was fine. The main decks it was appearing in were still Hog Rider decks, but
Yeah,
Goblin Drill was
still
fairly
to this
popular
day.
in June, so it wasn't uncommon to see those two paired together. And since the Dagger Duchess Tower Troops prominence was contributing to the popularity of Siege decks as a response to it,
Almost
you saw
finished chat.
Firecracker
2
appear in
minutes.
those decks occasionally thanks to its ability to deal damage to towers without needing to cross the bridge. The following month, you saw a lot more Firecracker with Goblin Drill thanks to the Goblin Drill evolution, and less play in Siege following the Dagger Duchess nerf. She never seemed like the
Yeah,
best
Dagger
choice,
Duchess
since her
fell
win
off
rate was
hard,
still
man.
low, but
Bro,
a solid chunk of
wait, what are even fucking tower troops now? Like, they literally dog shit, except for Royal Chef, and Cannon in a few decks, but Dagger Duchess dog shit. Royal Chef though, in like Sparky, Goblin Giant, and RG decks, and Cannoneer, and I don't know, not that many decks, but yeah, Princess is better.
top players continue to find success with her. And nothing has really changed since then. As of October
bought the Dagger
2024, she
Duchess,
still
I
has a
remember.
below average use rate in challenges with by far the lowest win rate of any evolution. She doesn't appear on the most popular deck list anymore and is hardly seen in the top 200. She's no longer seen in a wide variety of decks, mostly just in Hog, Mighty Miner Cycle.
and it went
It
fuck
seems like she
off.
has
It-
these
it
bursts
stays
where she's seen in
around.
some meta decks for a month or two, then goes right back to being present only in Hog Mighty Miner, which isn't the worst position for a card to be in, but it's not ideal.
best,
For how
yeah.
much hate she's garnered though, I'm surprised she's been able to not get nerfed into the ground for this long. I don't think there are going to be any more major developments in the Firecracker's journey, at least not anytime soon. She certainly still has her group of core haters, but she's way less of a problem than she was for most of her past. Even though she's not seen a ton in competitive play anymore, she's still used in around 30% of decks on ladder. It's undoubtedly still an extremely fun and simple card to use, and can be a nightmare if you don't know how to properly deal with it. Even if you never spent money on the game, her evolved version has been pretty easy to obtain. For example, in February 2024
Yeah,
for
they gave it away
Valentine's
free.
Day, Supercell gave away a free evolution of the player's choice, and unsurprisingly, the most popular
Valkyrie?
pick was in fact Firecracker,
Oh,
where
that was
millions
a
of
different
people
one.
chose her. And there have been multiple other opportunities since then to get her for free. If there's more evolution giveaways in the future, I'm sure thousands of new players will get their hands on this menace. Well, maybe not if the Mega Knight evolution is a choice.
Oh.
Anyway though, thank you guys so much for listening. Let me know which card's history you want to see next, and I'll
Hey,
catch you
that
later.
was a good ass video, man. Hey, guys, go check out Gratz's channel. Makes good content. That's all. Have a good one, chat.